list. We're only listing species there once they're already pretty widespread. And that is, yeah, we need to be working to make these lists more proactive and more consistent.
Great, thanks, Emily. So we'll go on to Deah's slides next, and I know that Deah has some animations, so I will try to stay on top of it.
Yeah, I didn't think of that, sorry. So I'm just going to give you an overview of some of the, a range of the tools that are out there to conduct risk assessments on plants. But I wanted to be very clear about what risk is. Risk is the combination of likelihood and impact. And in the case of invasive species, or predicting what species will become invasive, we're thinking about the likelihood of arrival, establishment, and negative impacts. Okay, you can advance. So we're going to go from the shortest amount of time it takes to complete an assessment to the longest amount of time. And go ahead and hit it. So the first tool I'll talk about is, I'm calling this one the rapid risk screening tool. This is a 3-element screening process that includes those sorry, there's a leaf blower right outside my house that's got me a little flustered. But so it's those 3 elements of arrival, establishment, and spread. This tool is based, the one that I'm personally using in Florida is based on Helen Roy's horizon scanning work. But there are other rapid screening tools that are out there. Essentially, these take about 30 minutes to an hour to complete. You don't want to be completely thorough with all the information. We're just trying to get a quick and dirty prediction of risk. So horizon scanning I mentioned, but this is also used for pre-screening. So you can pre-screen a species to see if you want to invest a full risk analysis framework to it. Next. The Australian Weed Risk Assessment is kind of the gold standard across the world. It consists of 49 questions based on domestication history, invasion history, et cetera. And then also some of the life history characteristics. These take about 8 to 16 hours, and they are used in biosecurity and in some cases permitting. So in Florida, we do weed risk assessments for any of the non-native planting species for the state. Next. And then the PPQ WRA was built off of the AWRA. This is the national model that's used by the USDA. 39 questions, but what's great about this tool is they've incorporated uncertainty and distribution maps. These take a bit longer. They take about 1 to 2 weeks. There's a little more effort that's put in. You have to go through all the geopotential points to make those models. And again, this is used in biosecurity and on our national level, and some states use this for noxious weed listing. And okay. And then finally, pest risk analysis. This is more of a framework. This is EPO does this over in Europe. It's a 4-step process that includes risk assessment, where you look at initiation, risk assessment, risk mitigation, and risk communication. And these take months. So this is a full technical report. Okay, next slide. So there's been an effort to kind of think about risk assessment standards. Internationally, they do better than we do in the United States. But Helen Roy, again, put together a workshop, working group, and they determined 14 minimum standards that include things like those introduction, establishment, and impacts, description of the current distribution, any limitations to data, and inclusion of information sources. And then you'll see this uncertainty. We're really pushing to get uncertainty incorporated in these risk assessments. I list here specifically possible effects of climate change, because all of those tools that I just spoke of and in the previous slide, none incorporate climate change. So this is something that we're starting to think about as a risk assessment community. And so on a national level, I'm working with North American Invasive Species Management Association, NASMA, and in a national working group to kind of start talking about this stuff. We're writing a white paper that's loosely based on this Roy work to kind of provide some guidance and some standardization that could be used across all these tools. So there's no way we're all going to use the same tool, but if we follow the same sort of guiding principles, we might be able to compare some of the results. And that's all I have.
Super, thanks, Deah. So as I think I just want to like reiterate something that Deah just said, which is that there's this range of types of risk assessments that exist out there, from ones that can take an hour to ones that can take an entire year kind of thing. And in terms of thinking about range shifting species with climate change, a lot of this is going to be happening fast. A lot of this is new species that we don't know a lot about, that maybe some of our neighbors are dealing with. And so my argument on that is we need to start with these rapid assessments first. We need to get a lot of those in place so that we can quickly prioritize from longer lists using those 30-minute to an hour risk assessments, rather than focusing as a starting point the 2-week assessment type of things, because there's a lot of different species coming at us. So in terms of that question, so again, as Deah said, this Roy paper, which is a really nice one that we like, that we've been reading a lot, says we need to include climate change in weed risk assessments, but doesn't necessarily say how we should go about that or what we should be thinking about. So here are some of the things that we've been thinking about. So first is climate change is happening really fast. You saw this slide in Carrie's introductory talk. And what that means is we can't just be thinking about even our immediate neighbors for looking at species that are going to be coming our way. We can't just be looking at, the next county or the next town over. That in fact, the rapid pace of climate change means that we're going to be needing to think about species that are quite a bit further away than what we might be thinking about or typically thinking about today. And the added challenge with invasive species, of course, is that because, and especially when we're talking about plants, because many of these species are in the horticulture trade, others are easy to accidentally introduce on equipment or in seeds, that invasive plants and other invasive species are moving quickly. And so they're going to be here fast as the climate becomes suitable. And so recommendation on that is to make sure that we're flexible in terms of our geographic scope. And if we look at the Northeast specifically, and we've started to look a little bit broader than the Northeast too, for the most part, we're doing this. So the state risk assessments use different levels of geographic scope to sort of consider what could potentially be invasive. So in New York, for example, the New York regulatory assessment says that a species could be considered, could be evaluated by their regulatory assessment if the species is currently known to be anywhere from the Atlantic coast to Minnesota, and then sort of as far south, I think, as Missouri and the Southeast US. So nice and broad in terms of a geographic scope, and that's the type of thing that I think is going to allow us to be more flexible for climate change. And then as comparison, so New Hampshire, in our small sample of Northeast states, New Hampshire says that if a species is identified as invasive in any other New England state, then that can be evaluated with their regulatory assessment. So not quite as broad thinking, a little bit narrower. And so maybe we need to be kind of revisiting those and thinking like, okay, do we want to start broadening a geographic scope if that is within our risk assessments? And then Maine, Massachusetts, and Connecticut all have a risk assessment where there isn't necessarily a geographic scope kind of defined as to whether a species could be evaluated or not. In all of those cases, they say if the species is not known to be in that state, then the maximum kind of score that that species can get is what's called potentially invasive. In all three of those cases, there are potentially invasive species that have been successfully regulated, but this is something to be cognizant of and maybe watch out for in terms of whether the labeling that our risk assessments apply could be construed in a regulatory sense as lower priority, when arguably actually those species that are not yet in the state could be some of the highest priority because those are the opportunities to actually prevent a species from entering. And in terms of that geographic scope, so, some of what we would ideally love to have in all of these cases is a distribution model like the one that, that Matt and Tony Lynn both showed of the southern pine beetle and the projections of where that's likely to go. But the reality is that we don't have that for many invasive species, and especially invasive species that are still emerging, the ones that we really want to be addressing, early on in their invasion process. So I think some of what we need to be able to do in risk assessments is be flexible, that the risk assessment doesn't have to get fancy. It could rely on, for example, hardiness zone maps, or some information generally about the types of invaded ecosystems. It's certainly at the 30-minute to an hour rapid assessment side of things. And maybe when we get down to writing our lengthy reports, we might need a model to pair along with it. So those are just some thoughts that we have all had on this topic that we've been thinking about a bit. And now we have, so we finished the first two things. We have a little bit of time, and I'm going to stop my screen share. So if you have any questions or just discussion points that you want to talk about, Deah and Emily and I will turn on our video, and let's talk about it, and then we'll go to the breakout groups after that. And I would say also the other really nice thing about all being in a Zoom meeting rather than a webinar is you can also unmute yourself and go ahead and ask a question.
Karen? You hear me?
We can, yep.
Nobody reacted, so I was talking to the void. So these rapid assessments, where can we get a hold of those to use them? Are they available on your website? Or I think that's an interesting, I think that could be really helpful in math in terms of going through a bunch of different species. We've got all these lists of things and we haven't managed to get through too many for new risk assessments.
So one of the things we're working on at the IBIS assessment is we took the tool from Helen Roy's project. So it's those three scoring elements. You score the species based on, it's a scale of 1 to 5, and you multiply. So the highest possible score is 125 points. And so in our horizon scanning, I think in total we did all, and it works on all taxa. So we had to figure out where those thresholds were, but there's no defined threshold that a score of a 20 and above is, 20 to 60 is moderate and 60 and above is high. So we've started looking at the data to kind of figure out where those breaks are. And the hope is as soon as we finish the horizon scan, which we're projected to finish in March, we're going to start validating that tool. That being said, the tool, literally exists. Like it's, I put together some guidelines that I'm working with some folks at USGS to kind of get better language in those guidelines so that we can start sharing it, so that folks can use it. It's so easy. Like literally you can do a species in like 15, 20 minutes if there's a lot of data out there on it.
Yeah, are there some general sources that you consistently go to find that information about these different species for the rapid assessment?
For rapid assessments, we don't what I call like chase the literature. So if we're doing a full assessment, we might, go to a clearinghouse of data, like a CABI sheet or one of the invasive species, clearinghouse websites. And if for a full assessment, we'll chase and try to find the original information, go to the literature. But for these rapid assessments, we we'll use CABI sheets, we'll use, you know, if a university extension document, those kinds of things. So it's a little more of the gray literature, but CABI is a great source. They've really improved in the 8 years I've been doing this. Those data sheets are pretty thorough now. GBIF for your data points. For other species, I think bison, GLONAF. So that's something that I think Teresa Cully is going to be working on, you know, getting together a list of like where to go, and like cataloging and getting, you know, repository for some of the information that we're using to conduct, you know, the full risk assessment, you know, the bigger, more time consuming risk assessment.
We have a question that came up in the chat that's thinking about species that might not already be in the United States, but might be coming in through ports of entry and you know, different introduction pathways at the border. So how do these species fit into the rapid assessment framework? And are there species more commonly seen in ports, but which have not been reported at the state or regional level? So kind of thinking one step outside of our borders and how that fits into the risk assessment framework.
So part of the risk, what we included with our rapid risk screening is we do catalog and you identify the pathways. Specifically, we're using this tool to look at species that are on the horizon. So we're trying to identify the unknown. So we literally, we started with CABI with, you know, their list of species that aren't already in Florida. So this is a Florida specific horizon scan. There's some other horizon scans that are going on a national level that do similar things. They find a good clearinghouse of species list, whatever's not here yet, then that's what we put through the screening tool. But in terms of the way that EPO uses it is I think they got a working group together and put together a list of species that weren't in the European Union yet, or very small, you know, distributions. And then they use the rapid screening to sort of triage that list into, you know, a more manageable, you know, I forget how many they started with, but they ended up doing full risk assessments, I think on around 100.
Great, thank you. So there's another question in the chat that maybe Bethany, you can take a stab at, and then Emily can speak to a little bit too, which is, who do you think should be performing these assessments? So Emily talked a little bit about how most states are doing things really differently. So maybe Bethany, you could talk about what that looks like in the Northeast from your experience. And then kind of a follow-up to that is, are you advocating for many individuals to perform rapid assessments for the same taxa, or maybe there's a better way to go about this?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I mean, we have done some risk assessments on species, those range shifting species in the Northeast. And my take on this is that not, you know, all risk assessors are not created equal, and nor should they be, right? Like, we're not all the same person. We view things differently. We're going to have different perspectives on what we as individuals consider to be high risk, low risk, et cetera. So especially when we're talking about a rapid risk assessment, I think that if we've got a couple of different people performing the same thing, then that's more powerful, because that gives us that sense of our own uncertainty in how we read or understand the information that's out there. I think the key part of this is, where does all that information go, you know, and do we have a repository? And I know that at the national scale, Deah has been involved in talks of trying to promote, you know, a single repository like the one that New York State has, for example, for all of their risk assessments. If we had something like that at a national level, that would be, I think, really, really helpful for the National Invasive Plant Councils to work on.
So the next question was kind of following up to that. So maybe, yeah, Emily and Deah, if you could think about or speak on what efforts there are to standardize these processes and the process for regulation.
Yeah, so I think that I just want to emphasize this idea that I think in an ideal situation, you might have just a couple of people performing these assessments. So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel every time. So if somebody in one state has already put a ton of work into assessing a species, it would be really great if folks in other states that are interested in that are able to access that assessment and then maybe build on that for what's going on in their own state. So yeah, this idea of having some kind of more central repository where people are able to share this information is I think really the direction that we should be heading.
I would add, actually, this is where the PPQ WRA tool that you know, a more involved risk assessment, but this is the federal model. It does do a really good job of diagnosing predicting the risk. You know, it has 2 risk elements: establishment and impacts, and then geography is a little bit in there. It's a continental scale model, but then it's your geopotential models that show where the risk applies. So, you know, they're building a library of weed risk assessments that you can access on their website. That, you know, if you're looking to do some regulation within your state and they've already done the risk assessment, you can look at it, you can see their results, and then also just double check that map to make sure it applies to your area.
Although I don't think they're actually including climate change in those models. So with a grain of salt in terms of how the geographic potential applies to your area, that's under current climate. So we need to be thinking slightly more broadly.
Yeah, and just to echo that, so there's a comment in the chat that it might be really difficult to get states to standardize. So maybe that, you know, information sharing and at least making it more transparent what all of us are doing is a good first step to that. So it is 3:25, which is the time we had set to move into breakout rooms. I don't know, we might have some time for any last minute comments, and I saved some of the questions that didn't get answered in the chat that maybe we can circle back to. But yeah, it's time for breakouts.
I lost my unmute key, but I found it again. So listen, thanks everyone very much for all of your thoughts and ideas on this topic. We've hopefully got lots of pages of notes to check in on later and some good ideas that came out of those. If you have other ideas or thoughts that just came up just now, or if you want to restate or amplify something that you talked about in your discussion, feel free to put that in the chat right now. We'll save the chat with any other comments after we close. So our plan for these data for this year in 2021, so this is true for this workshop, it's true for tomorrow's workshop on resilience, and also if you're signed up for the extra optional workshop tomorrow morning on our visioning steps towards climate smart invasive species management, our hope is to use that information that you guys provide to synthesize those recommendations and give them back in the form of some of those management challenges. So, so thank you and stay tuned for those. We are a little bit early, which means that you've got extra time to add anything in the chat that you want to make sure gets recorded. But the next place that you're going is at 4 o'clock. So you've got, looks like 8 minutes to get there. We have our networking event, so opportunity for you guys to see each other and talk a little bit more. The networking event is in a different Zoom link, and or maybe Abby, do you have that handy that you can post into the chat?
Sure.
Super. So Abby's going to post that in the chat so you know where you're headed at 4 o'clock. And otherwise, we will hopefully see you well in 8 minutes and then again tomorrow. Thanks. So Abby just stuck the networking link in the chat. And if you've got any other ideas, stick them in there. Thanks, everyone.